King's Hants is a largely rural riding, the agricultural heartland of Nova Scotia. It stretches from the Annapolis Valley, along the airport corridor to the Shubenacadie River, and out to the Bay of Fundy.
88,000 people, 44,000 homes stretched across 4 counties. How do you get to meet people in a large area, in a large rural area, in the middle of a COVID?
With an e-bike, apparently, and well-known Conservative Peter MacKay riding shotgun.
Does it pedal for you?
It just sort of augments the pedaling.
Oh.
Mark Parent represented the provincial riding of Kings North from 1999 to 2009 and served as cabinet minister for the agriculture, labor and environment portfolios. He's returning to politics after a 10-year hiatus.
When the Prime Minister's budget office put out the statement that all things being equal, the budget wouldn't be balanced until 2070. And I looked at my grandson, my oldest grandson, and I said, he'll be my age before the budget's balanced. Do I want him to inherit that sort of world?
Remember the name.
And Minister of Environment, importantly. So he has a lot of experience to call upon.
Yeah. What made you decide to come out and support Mark today here?
Well, I've known Mark a long time. Even before it was really en vogue, he's always been a strong proponent for the environment. He's always been somebody that really put the emphasis on protecting our natural resources. And I think he's a Renaissance man.
Rural Nova Scotians have historically followed a red Tory tradition. Increased urbanization in this riding could make its politics harder to predict.
So historically this has been a Conservative riding, but I think what's interesting about this riding, if you look at the last 20 years or so, is that up until 2019 this was a Scott Bryson riding. He was the Member of Parliament beginning in 1997. While he was a Progressive Conservative member, he switched parties to the Liberals and was able to hold the seat, and for the rest of his time in Parliament he was a member of the Liberal Party. With the Liberal government of Justin Trudeau, he was in the cabinet.
When he retired in 2019, Bryson and party faithful rallied behind Hants County lawyer Cody Blois. The Liberals held the seat, but popular vote dropped 25%.
One of the questions now for this riding is this in fact a Liberal riding now, or is it a riding that Scott Bryson held for a long time as a very popular local member of Parliament?
Look, I'll leave this with you. I'm the Liberal candidate as well. I'm pulling a little bit of double duty here, fundraising it. Hi, love. It's Cody Blois. And you know I took over from Bryson 2 years ago.
I do, and I knew Scott well.
Yeah.
With just 2 years in the House, much of it spent in pandemic lockdown, opportunities to connect with constituents have been limited.
It's Cody Blois, your Liberal candidate here. You know Mike Butler, of course.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
You admitted it. That's good.
We're fundraising for the Valley Regional Hospital, so if you get some change when you're inside, we'd appreciate it. Obviously here on in the main street, it's more just about getting your name out there, saying hi to people. It's not the same level of depth conversations you'll have on the doorsteps. We're hearing a lot about healthcare, of course, because of the residual from the provincial election. And when I look at our plan, it's really resonating around long-term care, increasing wages for CCAs, particularly around primary access to care for physicians and allied health professionals, and mental health. I mean, we've just gone through a pandemic. We know that mental health is a huge priority, and those things are really resonating.
Are you getting any kind of dialogue on the doorsteps about why we're having this election during the pandemic? Is that coming
There's
up?
some of that, but I think at the end of the day, minority parliaments, that could always be a question, right?
NDP candidate Stephen Schneider is a criminologist and a university professor. He ran in the past 2 federal elections, winning almost 18% of the vote in 2019.
I'm Steve Schneider. I'm the NDP candidate running in the federal election.
I know my son, who has a disability, has been trying to find cheap housing.
Yeah.
It's been impossible.
It is. I mean, there's a housing crisis, no doubt, and that's why and the NDP is really pushing for more co-op housing, more government housing as alternatives to market housing, which is so expensive. And
the rent here is much cheaper than.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, there's really 4 key issues in Nova Scotia, 4 crises, as we say. There's, of course, the pandemic, COVID pandemic. There's the housing crisis. There's the public health care crisis. And, of course, there's the climate crisis. The issues that I'm hearing most at the door right now is really housing and healthcare, because that's what affects people in the here and now, especially housing.
Known for its apple orchards, vineyards, and scenic farmland, King's Hants also includes fast-growing commuter hubs and the second fastest-growing municipality in the province.
There's been a lot of growth here, much more so than most Nova Scotia municipalities. About 5% growth we're expecting in the current census period. And our municipal councils approved housing for about 10,000 people in the last couple of years, so we're now starting to see quite a bit more growth. In fact, over the last year to date, compared to last year, we're seeing about 160% increase in building permits for new housing.
How much of that is affordable housing?
That's a really good question. Probably not much. It's all free market housing. There's quite a mix, though, in terms of rentals, freehold townhouses, and single unit dwellings. But affordability, it's with the market. So how much of it turns out to be affordable is yet to be determined.
For the first time in many generations, Nova Scotia is blessed with a good problem. We have more people that want to be in Nova Scotia than want to leave. And for a long time, there was an outpouring, particularly of young people, that were searching for opportunities elsewhere. We've stemmed the tide on that.
House prices and rents skyrocketed this year. Tent encampments in Halifax made national news, but the housing crisis is province-wide.
Well, there's always been a housing crisis here. There's always been a very high level of homelessness, because there's also a very high level of poverty. We actually have one of the highest child poverty rates in the province, in the Valley. So here, we have a lot of affluence, but at the same time a lot of poverty, which is, a microcosm of Canada. CMHC, Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation, had been in affordable housing for years, directly financed affordable housing, was directly involved in government housing. When Paul Martin was the finance minister in the 90s and his massive austerity program, he basically got CMHC out of the federal government out of social housing. And ever since then, we've seen homelessness increase significantly. We've seen significant problems in housing people with disabilities, mental health issues, seniors. Affordability issues have become to the fore. So what I'd like to do is get government, in particular the federal government, back into social housing, funding and building social housing directly, affordable housing. And I'd also like the federal government to be more involved in promoting co-ops and providing, helping to organize people to start a co-op, helping to provide funding, expertise, helping them find land.
We are going to have a plan to try to help people rent to own. So a lot of people get caught in cycles right now where they're renting, but they don't have the equity to be able to borrow from the bank to be able to make the investment in the home that can serve as a nest egg later in life. We want to help people make that transition. We can work with a landlord and tenant to be able to make sure that eventually that rental income, that rental expenditure is going to lead to equity.
Rent control is something that's been done here in Nova Scotia, has been helpful, but I'm not sure it's the long-term solution. The long-term solution is to get adequate housing geared to different income levels, subsidized housing that will help people get into housing.
What's the biggest issue for you in this federal election?
Healthcare, access to healthcare.
And why?
Well, because we're getting to a place where we need more health care, and it's not shaping up to be too readily available right now. And there have been some promises made. It's not an easy issue to solve, and I don't know whether they have anything more than a promise.
I think unity of our country is standing together as a group, like we've done for the most part through COVID, keeping us united with vaccines and doing what the health experts are telling us to do, so that we can move forward as a country and not turn into the USA.
We know that healthcare remains a top issue for Nova Scotians. We just went through a provincial election where that was the case. For me, long-term care is something that is extremely important. This for me is personal. I have a 94-year-old grandmother at home. She's getting to the point in her life that we need to get her continued access to care, and right now there's about a 1.5-year wait list to be able to get in. We know that that's creating backlogs in terms of surgeries and some of the kind of routine procedures in hospitals. So our commitment to try to increase access to space around long-term care and increase the wages for continuing care assistants. These people do tremendous work. They're overworked and frankly underpaid. Although this is provincial jurisdiction, we want to make sure that there's money on the table to help get their wages up to $25 an hour.
For Stephen Schneider, the keystone of the NDP platform is pharmacare.
So we want to make sure everyone in the country has coverage for prescription drugs, and that includes seniors who are on a provincial government plan but don't have all their prescription drugs covered by that provincial plan or through old age security. So that is really one policy issue that resonates with a lot of people. The only G7 country that has a universal health care plan or regime that doesn't offer prescription coverage, universal prescription coverage.
For Mark Parent, increasing federal transfers for health care is key.
One of the things in the platform that I was pleased to read was the 6% increase guaranteed over 6 years for the health transfer from the federal to the province without strings attached, because it's really the province that needs to decide the best way to spend that money, how to allot to mental health, acute, preventative health care.
Critics say Aaron O'Toole's platform opens the door for provinces to pursue for-profit health care.
The platform that Aaron O'Toole has put out in the Conservative Party is absolutely unambiguous that we need public access to health care. That will be protected. Okay, so 100%, and that's incredibly important for me because I have a grandson with severe skeletal problems that needed treatment in the IWK. I couldn't afford it. My daughter, who's divorced from her husband with 2 young kids, barely getting by, couldn't have afforded it.
When Nova Scotia launched its COVID vaccine program in December, it seemed an end to the pandemic was in reach. With a spike in cases this week, the province has delayed moving to Phase 5. A large cluster of those cases is in a group of unvaccinated residents, and more cases are expected.
We have a solution, and that is vaccination. And that's the most frustrating part. I don't think anyone anticipated that we would have such, resistance among a segment of our population. There's part of me that supports mandatory vaccinations just simply because of my frustration. We shouldn't be here. And really, the rest of the country, quite frankly, can learn from Nova Scotia because we here have kept the numbers low. Why? Because we've listened to the scientists, we follow the rules, we have put the greater good over our selfish, inconvenience.
Thank you so much for your patience.
Oh, no problem. No problem.
But it's not just the Liberal Party position. You look across the board, Dalhousie University, lots of institutions, private businesses, they're moving in this direction. And it becomes a bit of a tension, doesn't it, between individual freedoms and collective rights. I think at the end of the day, it's a reasonable ask to say that if you have access to the vaccine, if you've taken it, you are given privileges that perhaps others that have chosen not to take the vaccine don't have those same opportunities. The longer that the virus is able to mutate and to become different variants, the less effective that what we have in our arm might be, and so I'm in support of it.
What's the biggest issue for you in this election and why?
The environment, without question. I've got 2 young children here, 2.5 and 3 months old. It's their future, and we got to make it better for them. I'd like to hear some specific, some specific targets in the near term. We hear a lot of vague sort of targets by 2050, 2060. I want to know what we can do now.
I think climate change is a big issue right now that I'm very concerned about, and I think a lot of my generation is really concerned about because we're going to be dealing with the later effects of it in our lives. So I'm very interested in the candidates who are covering that and want to deal with it and want to find real solutions.
We've got to fight for our lives here, and people aren't getting the message. COVID should be teaching us that to turn our back on our fellow men and women in this world and their children, our children, and the rest of life, and the things that sustain that life, which is all the rest of it, that's who we are. This is a fight for our existence. This is not a matter of, schoolyard argument or anything. This isn't about theatrical debating. This should be a matter of sharing all the knowledge we can bloody well share and fast. And that should be what Parliament's doing. Real debate instead of preordained scripted argument for sound bits on TV for 20 seconds.
So in 2019, as a new candidate, following the footsteps of Scott Bryson, you were asking yourself, okay, what is going to be the number one issue? There's obviously a history of progressive conservatism in this area. It was climate and environment, bar none. That was the number one issue that I heard. That's what they want from their Member of Parliament, the constituents here. We have a number of programs that have been introduced in the budget and that exist in our platform around helping farmers and producers procure green energy on farm, for example, to be able to use soil health as a way to sequester carbon. Basically a number of green initiatives that are going to really speak to our agriculture sector here in Kings Hants. That's one. The other one is the homeowner retrofit programs. So when you look at the $5,000 rebate that's available to homeowners, when you look at the $40,000 interest-free loan where individuals can borrow to be able to make investments in their home to reduce emissions, those are going to be concrete programs that we're going to see right here in Kings Hants.
No more gas, no more oil. Keep the carbon in the soil.
So some of the things we do locally would be to get off coal, first of all. Our electrical grid is still too much powered by coal, so we need to get off coal. We need more energy efficient homes, so we need to provide more rebates and more cash incentives, loans, grants for people to make their homes more energy efficient. Obviously, we need to do mitigation efforts as well, because as you well know, we have the highest tides in the world here in the Minas Basin, and so with the oceans rising because of the melting of the polar ice caps, we're in much more danger of flooding, especially during hurricane season, and we're going to see more hurricanes, more intense hurricanes more frequently.
The other thing that's happened too that's changed the game quite substantially, and people need to wake up to this, I think, is that the IPC has said we've passed the tipping point. When I was involved as Environment Minister, I was warning everybody we were working. We set the stage for the province to be a leader in the green and the greening of the economy, and unfortunately it wasn't picked up the way it should have been by both Daryl and by Stephen. Not that they not bad people, but they didn't pick that up. And now we've reached the point, the IPC says we've reached the tipping point. So we have to begin to shift the money and our energy to that adaptation, building our sewage plants, make sure that they can handle rising sea levels, helping farmers who have to cope with differing rainfalls, either too much, as we've had this year, or too little. So that adaptation is something actually that all Canadians get on board with, whether they feel climate change is human-induced or whether it feels it's just happening because the climate changes. We all realize we need to adapt to it. Something is going on.
What's your biggest issue in this election?
In the local community, I think the accessibility to health care is my biggest concern locally and federally. And I think the unnecessary calling of an election in the middle of a pandemic is not appropriate. And then I'm disgusted in Canada's giving up on women's rights and in Afghanistan, abandoning those people. Those are my three biggest concerns.
Probably like what's been happening most recently is probably finding the bodies at the residential schools. Like, that's a big issue to me, and how that's going to be dealt with, how that's going to be handled, and how we're going to move forward from that. That's a pretty big issue for me.
This riding has 3 native bands, is home to 1 in 4 Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq, and was the site of the only Indian residential school in the Maritimes. Radar did not identify any unmarked graves at the Shubenacadie School.
What does reconciliation mean to you?
Reconciliation means to me admitting and owning up to the hurt that has been caused, the devastation to people of the past, but then working together as fellow Canadians to try and make a good life for everybody.
I had a conversation with an elder from Shubenacadie the other day named Roger Lewis, and we were talking about the term reconciliation, what it means. And Roger said to me, he said, look, it's the fact that we have conversations, that we're a partner at the table, and so everyone's going to have their own idea of what that represents. I thought Roger's definition was very strong in terms of making sure that they're part of the conversation. I think for far too long, Indigenous communities were not part of the conversation.
The federal government needs to have a relationship with First Nations on a nation-to-nation basis. We need to respect treaty rights. We need, in my opinion, reparations towards Indigenous people, not just for residential schools, but for a whole range of reasons.
Near Windsor, Commercial fishermen and Mi'kmaq conservation researchers monitor the Avon River.
Today we are setting eel traps and gill nets to try and get a baseline study of what is in these rivers.
Beyond them, a steady stream of heavy equipment twinning Highway 101. The project will replace the 50-year-old causeway in Abateau, a set of tidal gates, that divide the Avon River into saltwater marsh and freshwater reservoir, known as Lake Pisiquid. When the gates are closed, fish can't go upstream.
So every dam in Canada has to have what they call an ecological flow, or the necessary flows to sustain life. This was the exception.
In March, Federal Fisheries Minister Bernadette Jordan, in consultation with First Nations, issued a ministerial order requiring the gates be opened to improve fish passage. That drained the reservoir and divided the community.
This canoe club, I think it's produced, or canoe kayak club has produced, I think, 3 Olympians, which is maybe not that important for some people, but it's been a great recreation resource for my kids anyway. I didn't really ever think it was going to come to this. I mean, this is, I don't think what many people anticipated or expected.
So this was once all lake. We've had 50 years of an ecosystem here that we've accepted, we've embraced. We had a provincial Liberal government, and we had a federal Liberal government, and we ended up with no lake. And we couldn't get any satisfaction anywheres on this.
As a developer, Bryson also features the lake when marketing to new homeowners.
What do you show them now? You show them a mudflat with some grass growing on it. When the wind blows, the sand that blows up and down this river system, people can't sit on their houses up here. The tide doesn't come in here anymore because you can't let it in. And now we're just letting our fresh water go into the Bay of Fundy, which Martok could use this winter for making snow.
Upstream, Ski Martok draws water from the river to make artificial snow. With water levels low, they are working with government to develop an alternate strategy for this winter.
So right now, we are witnessing the transformation of an ecosystem back to a high-value ecosystem. The dust, there hasn't been dust for 2 months. The plants are now growing. I guess people just kind of think about this side. They don't think about what happens on that side when you hold back the water. And what happens on that side is you suffocate and you give the fish no water. When you shut the big steel gates, it closes, locks the water off, those fish down there die.
First Nations and advocates for the fish passage have established a treaty truck house at the causeway.
And the amount of subversive racism I've seen in this area when people try to talk about First Nations right, I've been told multiple times that they don't apply here, that I can go fish somewhere else, which really shows a lack of understanding. It's not about fishing this river, it's about protecting the fish.
I don't like the federal government. They always walk away. Every event that we go to, we try to talk to them, ask them questions. They walk away. NDP, they stick with us.
As construction moves closer to the river, Minister Jordan and DFO are under fire for lack of engagement with all stakeholders.
And the chiefs, which is a representative of the rights holders, have spoken. They want the restoration of this ecosystem to stop the infringement of their right. Our fishery has spoken. Our fishery wants the minister to look after the fish stocks. And that's her job. And she's done her job by putting forward this ministerial order.
As MP, Cody Bloys wrote to the minister asking that the ministerial order be modified.
There have been local concerns that have been raised about the construction of the ministerial order. The position that I've taken as a member of parliament has been that we need to adjust that order to be able to meet the concerns of the local community that I feel have not been addressed to date.
A lot of the Windsorites are really distressed. It's not so much the issue for them of lake, of fish, etc. It's just they feel their community is being torn apart and they just want to get back together as a community.
As Nova Scotians prepare to go to the polls for the second time this summer, political scientist Aaron Crandall is weighing the outcome and whether the provincial Conservative win is telling.
Well, let's hope that you get it.
What a night!
When the provincial election outcome first came out, my reaction was, this is not going to necessarily tell us anything about the federal election campaign. The Progressive Conservative Party in Nova Scotia is quite different in terms of its platform from the Conservative Party federally. As this federal election campaign has gone on and we've seen the Conservative Party try to campaign, or at least the Conservative leader, Erin O'Toole, try to campaign fairly close to center, increasingly I'm thinking that there could be some parallels happening between this provincial election and the federal election.
Do you have any predictions?
What we can expect from Kings Hants is a potentially a bellwether riding for Atlantic Canada in terms of how the Conservative Party is going to perform. If we see this riding go Conservative, that really bodes well for the Conservative Party's performance, I think, across the country.
In Wolfville, I'm Heather McCauley for CPAC TV.